For most of us, a bad investment doesn't end up costing us millions, and certainly not billions. But in the realm of architecture and construction, these kinds of insanely costly failures happen alarmingly often. So put a pillow on the floor, because your jaw's gonna drop hard when you hear the cost of some of these unbelievable construction fails. China's ghost cities. Across China, there are cities where the traffic lights turn from red to green, but no cars cross the junctions. Streets are well paved, but no one walks on them, and skyscrapers tower all around, but they're empty. These places are known as ghost cities. They're decked out to house thousands, but are lacking one vital factor: people. Ghost cities are a symptom of a big problem in China, where the rapid construction of new cities far exceeds people's desire to live in them. In attempts to stimulate economic growth in these areas, local governments instead end up racking up colossal debts when people take too long to filter in, or in some cases, never come at all. All in all, this overzealous construction trend has cost China trillions, with one troubled project alone sapping $200 billion from investors. This project, the Yujiapu Financial District in Tianjin, China, was heavily modeled on Manhattan and aimed to rival the Big Apple as one of the world's leading financial centers. But when people failed to flock to the development, funds dwindled and construction slowed almost to a halt. It now stands in limbo with a very uncertain future. I guess ghost cities proved that the phrase, "if you build it, they will come," doesn't always work out so well. Ryugyong Hotel, North Korea. While skyscrapers in China can be erected in a matter of weeks, this was certainly not the case for one particularly grand hotel in Pyongyang, North Korea. The Ryugyong Hotel has been under construction since 1987, and while its exterior was finally completed in 2011, the inside remains unfinished. The building features 3 grand wings, forming a visually impressive pyramid with a disappointing backstory. At 1,080 feet tall, it was intended to be the gem of the Pyongyang skyline, decked out with rotating restaurants, casinos, and nightclubs. But the build was plagued with issues thanks to North Korea's constant economic woes, alongside reports of precarious, unsafe construction. When completed, its construction costs are estimated to be $750 million, a full 2% of North Korea's gross domestic product of $40 billion. Earning that much money back is proving difficult, what with North Korea's less than stellar international reputation and the difficulty of even entering the country for tourists. But there's one main obstacle to profit that trumps the rest. The hotel remains unopened to this day, standing only as a reminder of the North Korean regime's failings. South China Mall. Before it was overtaken by Dubai Mall, South China Mall was the largest shopping center by total area of any in the world. But while holding this title in the early 2000s, it was simultaneously considered a ghost mall because of how eerily empty it was. The shopping complex, located in Dongguan in China's Guangdong province, was built to host well over 2,000 stores, but opened in 2005 with a mere 386. In the next 5 years, that number would only fall further. And while it had announced its forecast of 200,000 plus visitors a day, the reality was closer to 200. For years, entire floors of the mall remained unoccupied, and 99% of its store spaces were still vacant in 2008. The only parts of the 7,100,000 square feet complex that saw were its cinemas and built-in amusement parks. The issues came from the fact that the mall was, and remains, difficult to reach without personal transport. On top of that, the targeted upper-class clientele never showed interest, and Dongguan's lower-class inhabitants don't tend to have the expendable income to splash at such a mall. More than a decade after a rebranding as New South China Mall, the number of vacant storefronts has started to decrease, and visitors are slowly beginning to trickle in. But with a construction cost of $1.3 billion, it's going to be some time before South China Mall can recover from its reputation as a failure of colossal proportions. El Helicoide, Venezuela. Originally constructed as a symbol of progress under the regime of military dictator Marcos Pérez Jiménez, El Helicoide in Caracas, Venezuela has had an interesting past, to say the least. The layered, spiralized building began construction in 1956, aiming to be a luxurious shopping mall with endless boutiques, cinemas, and even a heliport. And today's money, the construction cost topped out at $90 million. but with the high-class clientele it aimed to attract, this would surely be made back quickly. To make sure it was to the taste of the highest-paying visitors, families were evicted from shantytowns in the surrounding areas. But karma balanced the scales for that ruthless approach in 1958 when Marcos Perez Jimenez was overthrown, and the partially constructed project was canceled. The building was never truly completed and has been repeatedly damaged by political bombings in the years since. At points, it's thought to have been inhabited by as many as 10,000 squatters, but nowadays it's used to hold political prisoners. At this point, the strange building with an even stranger past is pretty unlikely to ever be decked out in the restaurants and designer boutiques its planners had intended. Cincinnati Subway. Sometimes, total failure can blight a well-intentioned project beyond anyone's reasonable control. That's exactly what happened during the construction of the Cincinnati subway in the early 20th century. In an attempt to ease the burden of traffic on Cincinnati streets, a subway system was successfully proposed in 1917. Construction began, and in the following years, 7 miles of subway tunnels were built. Unfortunately, as the century wore on and the Great Depression went into full swing, construction costs doubled and the funds were bled dry. Before it was forcibly brought to a halt, the project had hemorrhaged the modern equivalent of around $200 million. All they had to show for it were a series of subway tunnels with no tracks. Despite various attempts over the years, Cincinnati has never been able to revive its failed subway project. The tunnels remain there to this day, abandoned. Ciudad Real Airport, Spain. When you pay $1.2 billion to build an airport, you expect to get some good use out of it, right? That's what investors in Ciudad Real Airport in Spain, which opened in 2009, had hoped for. But their plans had flaws from the beginning. For starters, the airport had aimed to provide airlines with a low-cost alternative to operating at Madrid-Barajas Airport, which was over 100 miles away. But putting the alternative at such a distance, right in the middle of nowhere, wasn't the wisest of ideas. Passengers didn't take to the new airport, and by 2012, it closed its doors. The debacle forced the airport's management company to file for bankruptcy after accumulating more than $300 million of debt. The real blow, however, came when Ciudad Real's owners tried to sell the airport. After rejecting a humiliating offer of $10,000 from Chinese investors, the airport was eventually sold for $62 million in 2016. Not only was this a mere 5% of its construction costs, the relaunch of the airport is estimated to cost another $640 million. Perhaps it would be best for investors to fly away from this airport and never look back. Lotus Riverside Block 7, Shanghai. On the morning of June 27, 2009, in the Minhang district of Shanghai, China, people woke to a loud rumbling that shook the ground. But it wasn't an earthquake. Instead, a 13-story apartment building had collapsed on its side. The building's construction was almost complete and had been just one of 11 in the newly built Lotus Riverside residential area. The collapse was found to have been caused when a garage was being dug out beneath the building. The removed soil was piled up next to a nearby creek, and the heavy weight collapsed the creek's bank, saturating the surrounding ground with water. The sodden ground eventually gave way, causing Block 7 to come crashing down. A construction worker was killed in the collapse, which resulted in lengthy jail sentences for those deemed responsible and resulted in economic losses of around $2.8 million. While the monetary cost is minimal compared to some others I've mentioned, the cost of a human life and a preventable tragedy puts it among the worst. Busted bridges. Sometimes construction failures are less about poor investments and more about seriously dangerous oversights and miscalculations. And when it comes to something like a bridge, getting your math wrong can have devastating effects. Take the Tacoma Narrows Bridge in Washington. Built in 1940 for the modern-day equivalent of around $110 million, the bridge was initially considered a marvel of its time. But its design had a serious flaw, which only became apparent when construction workers noticed it swaying an alarming amount as construction neared completion. Regardless, the bridge opened to the public, but before long, disaster struck. It turned out the walls that hemmed the bridge's sides caused strong winds to form vortexes as they passed over. These vortexes caused the bridge to sway and twist violently, adding serious stress to the suspension cables. On November 7, 1940, this stress proved too much, and the bridge collapsed. While no humans died in the collapse, a Cocker Spaniel called Tubby was killed after plummeting into the river, too frightened to leave her owner's car. The collapse was a hugely influential lesson in engineering and a costly mistake for the Tacoma taxpayers. R.I.P. Tubby. An even more tragic case was seen in 1994 at the Songsu Bridge over the Han River in Seoul, South Korea. The cantilever bridge had cost approximately $35 million in today's money when it was constructed in 1979. But despite its considerable price, poor construction was, quite literally, its downfall. Improperly welded steel trusses beneath the bridge led a sizable chunk of concrete to plummet into the river below during rush hour. 32 people were killed in the collapse and 17 more were injured. In light of the disaster, the whole bridge had to be redesigned and rebuilt. For the citizens of Seoul, shoddy workmanship not only meant the entire cost of the original bridge was wasted, but lives were too. MOSE Project Venice. Considering how much water surrounds and runs through it, it's hardly surprising that Venice has a flood problem. But when the Italian city launched its prime countermeasure in 1988, few could have predicted how little it would end up helping even 30 years later. The plan, known as the MOSE Project, was to construct 78 enormous hinged metal gates in the channels of the Venetian lagoon, weighing up to 300 tons apiece. The gates were intended to rise 66 feet high when needed, forming a flood barrier against the rising seasonal tides of the Adriatic Sea. Initially quoted at a price of $1.7 billion, constant delays, technical issues, and underestimated prices have racked up a total of more than $8 billion to date. And it's still not even finished. To make matters worse, thanks to the delays, parts of the underwater barriers are reportedly beginning to rust and leak already. There's also growing concern that the constructed gates won't even be able to help if they ever do get finished. Sea levels will, after all, continue to rise higher than what the walls were planned to defend against way back when the project started. Whatever the future holds for it, at $8 billion, the MOSE project continues to be one of the most expensive and long-lasting construction failures of all time. Does your city have any construction disasters on the scale of the ones I've covered today? Let me know in the comments section below. Thanks for watching.